attractions.
Let's move away from superstitious claptrap to the more fundamentals. How do you see things? Is this a buying opportunity, or is it...
well, following on from talking about selling in May, and the question always is there a fundamental behind it? And if we look perhaps at the last couple of times, and when we've gone to this precipice this time last year, you're really waiting for those policy triggers that somehow are going to relieve, as you pointed out, some of the monetary and banking issues. So will we have another European stab at a long-term refinancing operation like they had before? Will we have America start talking about QE3? Possibly the most likely would be something like China easing some of its reserve requirement and some of its credit constraints, and maybe those would be enough to do. So, and please, Marcus, by getting the pattern.
All the Greeks voting in a pro-austerity
and
government.
the polls that are coming through overnight are suggesting that more of the Greeks are willing to vote back in the previous, not the more extreme parties. And all the polls suggest that the Greeks want to stay in the euro. So to some extent, they are already signalling that they want to.
The question is, have you been selling in May?
Have we been selling in May?
Yeah.
Would we sell in May? We did actually ask people to take a bit of risk off the table, to use that phrase, so that you do, the run-up into the early quarter of the year looked pretty good. And it did feel as though the markets were ready to give off. We actually ironically thought the French election would be as problematic, perhaps not as much as the Greek one.
But it hasn't been. What do you think, Stephen?
Well, I think it's quite a good buying opportunity. That the market, we've lost 100 billion in May alone so far. And we've been trading between 4,000 and 4,500 for the last seemingly couple of years, and sell near 4,500 and start buying when it gets down to 4,000.
You can't go and look at history as a guide to what the market is going to do. Everybody does this in our industry. It is rubbish. You can but trade the trend. You've got to trade the trend. If you don't do that, you're catching knives all your life.
Well, Marcus, you were the one pointing to a pattern event on a monthly basis. Now you don't want Steve
very
to
true,
buy.
actually, very true. No, I wasn't advocating. I was just saying it's absolutely true. It happens to work.
The Greeks ultimately, I think, will have to get their act together. I think the Greek citizens are realising that, a run on the banks, taking all your euros out of the bank, guards on the border when you're trying to leave with all your cash, all of that is just so impossible and unpalatable that ultimately I think they will have to cop austerity, and I think they'll sort it out.
That the Germans will surrender before D-Day or Drachma Day or Disaster Day, that the Germans are going to have to step back on austerity to please Francois Hollande, to save Greece. They'll do it before the elections. Everybody will vote through a government that is pro-austerity and will get another holding period.
Yes, it's another kick the can down the road. They will put something in place to defer the decision.
Yeah, extend and pretend. They have to, because the banking calamity is just too great. And everyone's so interconnected. Ultimately, it's the US Federal Reserve which ends up printing the cash to lend to the European Central Bank. The whole world's connected. They cannot afford to let the precedent of an exit from the euro.
And it's interesting. One of the interesting things is that the Australian dollar is falling quite a lot. Whereas previously it was rising as a bit of a safe haven. Money was coming into Australia for the bonds here. Dollar was strong, but it's really collapsed in the last few days.
Yeah, but this time it's got the Chinese softening theme running through it as well. And the US dollar is more important than the Aussie dollar as a safe haven. When it gets really bad, the US dollar is what everyone buys.